At the end of March 2023, Hiroshi Nishiyama, a 50-year-old executive working for Astellas Pharma, one of Japan's biggest pharmaceutical companies, disappeared. He vanished into thin air. He did so on his last day in China, just before returning to Japan after 20 years working in the Asian nation. Soon after, of course, it became clear why he had disappeared. He had been arrested by the Chinese police, who accused him of nothing less than being a spy, or at least of being involved in espionage activities. The problem, VisualPolitik community, is not the charges, as dubious or otherwise as we may find them. The problem is that he is the 18th Japanese national to be arrested and charged with the same thing since 2015. In fact, suspicions and espionage accusations have become all the rage in China.
15th of May 2023, China sentences American citizen to life in prison for espionage.
And take note, because the espionage trend does not only affect isolated cases. The state media have targeted consulting and auditing firms, many of which are reportedly being investigated by national security agencies. For example, this has meant that in the political risk survey conducted by Oxford Analytica among several multinationals, China has already become the country second on the list for having the highest political risk in the world, behind only Russia. This also helps to explain what we have already told you many times, that although China is still a very important destination, more and more companies are studying how to diversify their production activity in this country. It may not be having a great impact in the media, but the truth is that the latest decisions of the Chinese government are setting off alarm bells in many multinationals. We're even talking about a change in the counter-espionage law that could put a lot of companies and professionals in the path of the hurricane. The question is, what on earth is going on in China? Why are so many red alerts going off? Is Xi Jinping's government using espionage legislation to pressure, punish, or cut ties with some foreign companies? What might all of this mean for the economic future of the People's Republic of China? Well, pay close attention, because in this video, we're going to answer all of these questions. And first of all, we need to understand where all of this started.
The closing.
It all started in 2014, barely a year after Xi Jinping became the all-powerful president of China, with headlines like this one.
China legislature adopts counter-espionage law. New law defines espionage, grants national security agencies authority to seize property.
This new law replaced the National Security Act of 1993 and granted national security agencies the ability to detain and prosecute activities that, in their judgment, were deemed detrimental to national security. It also allowed for the seizure of assets and property and the right to confiscate any device, money, or other item that was related to espionage. Xi Jinping certainly likes to have all of his ducks in a row. So not surprisingly, after this law was passed, the arrests began. For example, on the 15th of July 2016, when he was about to take a plane back to Japan, researcher Hideo Suzuki was detained. He did not know the reason. He was accused of being a spy. At the trial, he learned that one of the reasons was that he was asked a colleague, who was a Chinese official, if he knew anything about Kim Jong-un's alleged execution of his uncle. In the end, there was not much of a story, but he was still sentenced to 6 years in prison. The conditions? I'll let him tell you that for himself.
The hardest part was during the first 7 months of my detention. The curtains were closed in that room. I could only see the sun for 15 minutes with special permission. I cried when I saw it. Hideo Suzuki.
In 2017, 4 employees of NC Geophysical Survey and 2 employees of another local company were also arrested. In 2018, Chinese authorities reacted to Canada's arrests of Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou by detaining 2 Canadians on espionage charges, although no evidence was presented. These are just 3 examples of many more cases. Of course, though, that was only the beginning. Particularly in recent years, the Chinese government has stepped up its efforts to increase its control over almost everything. In 2021, the Cyberspace Administration of China introduced many new data export restrictions that came into effect on the 1st of September 2022 and are already making life very difficult for a lot of companies and professionals of all kinds. For example, these rules are restricting the access of companies, investors, and professionals to accounting information of Chinese companies, patent information, academic journals, and statistical series of all kinds. This, for instance, is the case of the most important database in the whole country, the one maintained by the Shanghai-based Wind Information, a huge source of economic and financial data that until now was widely used by foreign analysts and investors. However, that is becoming increasingly complicated. In the same vein, in 2019, another researcher from Hokkaido University was also detained. Today, 5 Japanese are being held in China on very similar charges of espionage. Not long ago, employees of the US consulting firm Bain & Co. in Shanghai were interrogated, and fellow US consulting firm Mintz Group. 5 workers were detained in March 2023. Beijing announced a cybersecurity review against the US semiconductor company Micron Technology. In the same way, the police also paid a surprise visit to the office of the North American networking and consulting company Capvision. You see, VisualPolitik viewers, the Chinese government has become obsessed with data, and that is exactly what explains news stories like this one.
China locks information on the country inside a black box.
However, possibly the most important measure with potentially far more serious repercussions came with the beginning of the second quarter of 2023. Check it out.
China approves wide-ranging expansion of counter-espionage law.
On the 26th of April, the main legislative body, the so-called National People's Congress, approved a very significant reform of the 2014 counter-espionage law. A reform that has set off alarm bells for companies, investors, and governments all around the world. The question is, why? We're going to take a look at that next and pay close attention because the repercussions of this change may be much more serious than you first think. But before we get going, a quick note. Taking a look at our statistics, we have seen that still more than 50% of the people who watch VisualPolitik are not subscribed to our channel. The question is, what are you waiting for? We are working very hard on cranking out as many great videos as we can. So if you like politics, economics, international affairs, and you want to be aware of the key issues that allow us to understand what is happening in the world and also have a good time, be sure to subscribe and activate the little bell button down there. It's 100% free. And now, let's get cracking.
The final blow.
VisualPolitik community, the latest reform of China's counter-espionage law has set off all the alarm bells. The question is, why? Well, basically because this reform incorporates 5 major changes. Firstly, the scope of the law is extended to all documents, data, materials, and items that, in the government's judgment, may be related to national security and interests, regardless of whether they are public or private. Because, in fact, the law does not even define what it consists of or what areas fall under the concept of national security. So what does this mean? Well, we'll see in a moment, but basically it means that everything is at the discretion of the government. Secondly, the reform also strengthens control over cyberspace. Thirdly, law enforcement is given more power to inspect and seize the luggage and electronic devices of anyone who may be suspected of dealing with sensitive data. Fourth, all Chinese citizens and organizations will have to report any suspicion of espionage at the risk of being considered complicit if they fail to do so. And you know what that could mean? Basically, that any behavior could be considered suspicious. We'll look at some examples of that later on.
Foreign academics like me will now avoid going to China if we can, because things like comments on social media could be seen as evidence of having committed espionage in the eyes of the Chinese government. Tomoko Ako, academic of the University of Tokyo.
Fifthly, any person who will be banned from leaving the country, whether they're national or even a foreigner, who is under investigation, even if he or she has not been prosecuted, or whose departure is considered to pose a risk to national security. To give you an idea, according to Reuters data, between 2016 and 2022, the number of exit bans multiplied by 8. So imagine what this reform could mean going forward from now. But wait just a minute. Why exactly has this law set off so many alarm bells? Well, mainly because it intrudes fully into the operation of private companies. The law not only talks about state secrets, but also about any kind of information and data. So naturally, the problem is that any company, in order to function more or less correctly, needs executives to have information. They need to know industry trends, consumer preferences, their savings levels, patents being published, industrial designs generated by the company itself, data from its rivals, and so on and so forth. However, now just being in possession of that kind of information could be a huge problem. And the same thing happens with the associated companies, auditors, consultants, or lawyers. Now, if they are foreigners or they have to work with this type of information, that could land them in jail after a trial that, in the case of espionage accusations, is done in secret without lights or stenographers. In other words, anyone who has handled sensitive projects or company information in China could now be charged with nothing less than counter-espionage under the Counter-Espionage Act. They are not even required to be credited with working for a foreign power, and this is a major problem because virtually anyone can get arrested and charged with espionage, which logically is one of the worst things that can happen to you in most countries in the world, and especially in autocracies such as China.
It has become even more unclear to foresee the situation, and companies are forced to be more cautious in many ways. Kengo Sakurada, head of the Japanese Association of Corporate Executives. The CCP's updated counter-espionage law sends a loud, clear signal to the world. There is no such thing as a private company in China. The state reserves the right to arbitrarily seize any property, steal any IP, harvest any data. Rep. Mike Gallagher, RWI, chairman of the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party.
And not only that, the public broadcaster CCTV has even charged consulting firms for allegedly causing damage to national security. So now, for example, to avoid being accused of espionage at any time, companies, executives and investors will have to work with the official data that the government decides to publish without being able to try and obtain or collect any information on their own, unless they want to risk ending up in the slammer. And that's just one of the many possible consequences. In addition, any new accusation for whatever reason may end up with national security agencies searching the electronic devices and offices of foreign companies, which could expose trade secrets and intellectual property. And what can I say? Given China's track record in this field, you need to take care. And in the United States, this is an issue that is generating more and more concern.
Our business leaders need to take off their golden blindfolds and recognize that the recent police raids of American companies Bain and Mintz are not one-offs, but part of a long, proud tradition of exploitation. Mike Gallagher, RWI. Congress should pass legislation empowering the Securities and Exchange Commission to limit the flow of funds to China. The effort should enjoy bipartisan support. George Soros.
Of course, having said that, the question I'm sure many of you are asking is, why? What does the Chinese government have to gain by targeting private information and data? Well, probably nothing. But Beijing is fundamentally obsessed with three things. First, as Teng Biao, an activist, legal expert, and professor at the China University of Political Science and Law in Beijing, argues, with all this control, the government wants to prevent foreign powers from instigating a color revolution in China. And okay, you may not think that sounds like the most likely thing in the world, but whatever the case, in Beijing, they seem obsessed with being in control and preventing anything that could affect the current regime. If all companies are on a short leash, so much the better. Second, the government wants to control the narrative about the real state of the Chinese economy. The China economy is not at its best right now. Youth unemployment is breaking records, only public investment is growing, and the foreign sector is slowing down. Does all that mean that the Chinese miracle is coming to an end? Well, just in case, in Beijing, it is clear that the less is known about it, the better. And third, the government also wants to prevent at all costs China's corporate, industry, and technology data from leaving the country to be used by rivals in the rest of the world. And now, the question I'm sure you're wondering is, and how could all of this affect the Chinese economy? Is it that Beijing wants to get foreign companies to leave the country? Well, nothing could actually be further from the truth. Stay tuned.
Open arms.
So you see, this is the latest major headache that the Chinese Communist Party regime is causing to foreign companies in the country, and also to local companies themselves. Of course, this isn't the first setback. In recent years, we have seen, for example, the war that Xi Jinping's government unleashed against the big Chinese tech companies. It began in late 2020 when Beijing halted the IPO of Alibaba's financial arm following critical statements by Jack Ma that were something like the final straw by Beijing's top brass. From that moment on, a campaign of new rules, fines, limits, boycott of corporate operations, and much more control of all these companies was launched by the Chinese Communist Party. Their objective? To limit the growing power that these groups were monopolizing in the country. I mean, daring to criticize Xi Jinping. Where have we seen that before? And not only that, shortly thereafter, on the 17th of August 2021, the well-known Plan for Common Prosperity was promoted to limit the excessive profits that, according to the government, many companies were making. In other words, for the first time in many years, the Chinese government once again targeted corporate profits. But let's keep going. At the same time, the Chinese government also began to strengthen its presence in the capital and especially in the management of large companies. To give you an idea, now both state-owned and private companies have, at the highest level, even above the CEO of the company itself, a representative of the party to supervise and participate in decision-making. These are just three examples to which are added tons of new regulations and now also the counterintelligence law reform we have seen. And of course, with all this in mind, the question, the really big question that seems to be on the table is, does the Chinese government want to scare away private companies? The most surprising thing of all is that apparently the answer is no. All of these plans clash head-on with the government's other two main priorities: to turn China into the world's great economic benchmark, and above all, in the short term, to encourage new foreign investment to boost its economy and overcome all the potholes in which it is currently mired.
Everyone wants us to invest more. It appears a bit like the left hand doesn't know what the right is doing. Jörg Wuttke, president of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China.
In fact, China's prime minister is in the midst of a campaign to try and improve the country's image and never tires of repeating again and again and again again that China is open for business.
The Chinese government has continuously said it welcomes foreign investment. However, a flurry of recent actions taken against US enterprises in China has sent the opposite message. Michael Hart, president of the American Chamber of Commerce in China.
This is the great contradiction of the Chinese government. A contradiction that is causing, for instance, that for the first time in the last 25 years, in the American Chamber of Commerce's business sentiment survey in China, the majority of companies have responded that they no longer see China as one of the top 3 priority investment destinations. Yes, this country will continue to be crucial because of its huge market, and international companies will continue to invest a lot of money in it, but it seems increasingly clear that this bet is losing strength. If previously the idea was to invest in China to serve the entire global market from there, now the idea is that investments in China should essentially serve the local market. That seems to be the direction in which they are headed. And you know what? This is not good for China, which is, on the other hand, what explains the Prime Minister's campaign. But if you'd like, let's take a look at some data. As you can see, youth unemployment is breaking records. Among those unemployed are almost 12 million university graduates, and this despite the fact that aging has caused the country's active population to fall by more than 40 million people in the last 3 years. Things are getting so dire that visits to the temples have multiplied by 4. Half of the visitors are young people born after 1990 who go there to pray for a job. We're not kidding. For their part, the state media have launched a campaign to reprimand university graduates for not taking jobs in activities such as construction, agriculture, or the hotel and catering industry. And that is not an isolated problem.
The world's second largest economy is not soaring across the board. Consumer spending is recovering, but manufacturing is retreating, and industrial profits are falling. Household income growth is weak, and youth unemployment is near a record high.
So you see, now the counterintelligence law reform promises to add fuel to this fire. China's reforms are starting to make life very difficult for companies just at the time when they need companies and corporate investment the most. Really, it's kind of crazy. We will be giving you many more updates about the status of China in our bulletin for patrons. I'll leave you the link in the description below. The question is it worthwhile for Western companies to continue investing in China? Will they maintain their investments or reduce their commitment to the Asian giant? How might this affect China? What would you do in that situation? You can leave us your impressions in the comments below, and let's start a respectful debate. And now, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to us all here at VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. All the best. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.